Hi everyone, this is the Rocky Mountain Myrick Short Takes on Suicide Prevention podcast. I'm Joe Huggins, filling in for Adam Hoffberg, and today we have two guest hosts, Anna Balzar and Dr. Shelby Scott. Anna is a clinical social worker and Shelby is a psychologist, and both are at the Denver VA, and they are our LGBT Veteran Care Coordinators. Together, they are going to interview the producer and director of the film, The Camouflage Closet, Heliana Ramirez and Michael Nedelman. During this podcast, we will hear excerpts from the movie and be treated to the breathtakingly haunting score of Andrew V. Lee. Welcome, Anna and Shelby. I'll turn it over to you, and you can introduce the movie and our two wonderful guests.
Hello, everybody. This is Shelby Scott, and let's start with an introduction to the film. So from the website, The Camouflage Closet is a veteran-led film about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, or LGBT, veterans' experiences with PTSD, trauma, and recovery. This project incorporates the first-hand perspectives of LGBT veterans who were provided with cameras, tools, and training to create their own video narratives. Heliana Ramirez is a clinical social worker at VA Palo Alto and a PhD student at UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. She has worked with veterans for the past 9 years as a health science researcher and community-based case manager addressing issues of mental illness and substance use. Although this veteran-led project is not considered research or clinical intervention, her past work with new media includes the use of video and public health and digital storytelling as a mental health intervention. Michael Nedelman is a journalist specializing in health and medical stories. Currently a producer at CNN, he also serves as a digital producer for ABC News Medical Unit. Previously, Michael worked on public health campaigns at the World Health Organization in New Delhi and the Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York City. Michael is a medical student at Stanford, and he holds a BA in film studies from Yale. And here's Anna with our first question.
So before we start talking about the movie, The Camouflage Closet, let's just take a moment allowing Heliana and Michael to tell us a little bit about themselves and tell us why this was an important movie to make. Let's go ahead and start with Heliana.
Thank you. When Michael Nedelman first approached me with the idea to make this film, I had been working with LGBT veterans at VA Palo Alto in the form of an LGBT veteran support group, and had just started a doctoral program working toward a dissertation focusing on strength and resilience among LGBT veterans. And what I had realized at that point was that the research is in a nascent state regarding LGBT veteran health. Because of policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we had very little research on this population. And the research that was available at that time was predominantly problem-oriented, disease-focused. So, for example, we started to know that this population has higher rates of suicide, higher rates of depression, and a whole host of medical health challenges. But we really didn't know very much at all about their strength and resilience. So I think that this film was really important for me personally and professionally because it was an opportunity for us to provide a platform from which LGBT veterans could not only speak on their own behalf about their experiences in the military and following the military service, but also give us some ideas about their strength and resilience and what recovery from mental health challenges, including PTSD, looks like for them.
You know, a lot of times we can't see ourselves, and then you see yourself on camera and you hear yourself speak, and you have all these really good thoughts, and then you hear them and you see it, and it's healing. It makes me feel like, hey, you know, I don't have to be agoraphobic. Hey, I don't have to isolate. You know, it's okay. Yeah. There's people that want to know your story. It's okay. You can tell them. You're not going to get hurt. That's the scary part for a lot of people. When they tell their stories, the icky parts, of course, I feel fists beating me on my back, but I know that that's not now. And I know that what I'm doing now is going to benefit clinicians and vets and hopefully artists and young girls to know that every story is important.
And I would add that for the VA, as the largest provider of LGBT healthcare in the world, based on the large numbers of LGBT veterans and service members, it was also a particular honor to work on this project with support from VA Palo Alto.
That's great. Thank you. I think that definitely came out throughout the movie, that strength and resilience piece. And Michael, how about you?
This sort of genesis of the project. So I moved out to California to start medical school in fall of 2012, but I moved a couple months in advance, didn't really know anyone in the Bay Area, and ended up in an arts workshop run by the Queer Cultural Center in San Francisco. And it was there that I basically linked up with the composer of the film, Andrew V. Lee, brilliant composer doing his PhD at UC Berkeley. And there happened to be some veterans in the group, and we realized in this workshop that in the 13 years that this program had been going on at the time, there hadn't been a single project that addressed LGBT veterans. And so this was less than a year after Don't Ask, Don't Tell ended. And so it seemed like such a no-brainer. Like Heliana mentioned, we didn't really have, and there's still a lot of work to do in terms of LGBT veteran mental health. And being on the cusp of medical school myself, and we rotate at the VA. Indeed, I did my psychiatry rotation at the same VA that I met Heliana and the veterans at. It just seemed like such a no-brainer. And along the way, fate kind of led me to Heliana, who, as she mentioned, had been really working in this space for quite some time.
Wonderful. Some of our listeners may be new to learning about LGBT issues, or even surprised to learn that there is an LGBT community within the military and the VA. Heliana, you briefly touched on this, but can you give our listeners some background on that?
Sure. It's actually a really interesting story. The very founding of the U.S. military as a unified force is actually credited to a man named Baron von Steuben, who we now know had sexual relations with other men. And his role in founding the U.S. military was so significant that his tombstone actually reads, indispensable to the formation of the United States. There's just an incredible history of LGBT people making major contributions to the U.S. military. America is home to nearly 1 million lesbian, bisexual, gay veterans, and 70,500 lesbian, gay, and bisexual military service members, which includes the active duty, reserves, and guard. Additionally, there are an estimated 134,000 transgender veterans and approximately 15,500 transgender service members, again, including the reserves and guard and active duty. One of the things that's really interesting about the rate of enlistment is that transgender people, it appears, are enlisting at higher rates than their cisgender, that is, non-transgender counterparts. And one of the theories behind this is the idea of a flight into hypermasculinity. Many people enlist around age of 18 in their early 20s, and that's also the time at which people start to oftentimes become aware of their gender identities and consider transitioning. So the idea is that for people who are born men and later identify as women, that is transgender women, they might go to the military as the most masculine place in society as a way to deflect questions from others about whether or not they're transgender or whether or not they're gay. They also might go to the most masculine part of society, i.e. the military, in a way to deal with their own internal questions about their sexual orientation and or gender identity. So again, we also see that gay men enter the military at higher rates than their non-gay male counterparts. What's really profound to me about this community is that while their service had been prohibited both by explicit and written and unwritten policies since the beginning of the U.S. military, as I mentioned previously, they've made significant contributions to the military. However, anti-LGBT military policies which prohibited their service oftentimes rationalize the prohibition based on ideas that LGBT people would be a security risk to the military, would undermine unit cohesion, and so forth. And now that we have some time to look back, it appears that LGBT people have made great contributions to the military, from everything from serving in highly specialized trained units like the Navy SEALs, to creating maps and camouflage and providing military medicine and even raising the troop morale through soldier shows. Now that we're really starting to think critically about LGBT service members and veterans, in the last 4 years, LGBT patient care services, under the direction of Dr. Jillian Shippard and Dr. Michael Kaus, have done an incredible job to get the VA to a place where we are providing LGBT patient-centered care. And this includes a wide variety of things from LGBT Veteran Care Coordinators who are at all of the VAs to help LGBT veterans access the care. We also have e-consults for transgender clinical care where VA clinicians can receive very quick clinical consultation for their transgender veteran care. We also have LGBT special emphasis programs to support our LGBT employees in their work at the VA, and a wide variety of other incredible programs on local levels, like safe space campaigns, where VA staff are really at the forefront of thinking about what we can do to make our healthcare center as accessible to and affirming of LGBT people as possible. And I think I would also like to mention that there are several dozen LGBT veteran groups that are being run throughout the VA across the United States, and they include clinical groups as well as peer support groups.
Great. Thank you. And then, Heliana, the movie appears to grow from work that you were doing at the Palo Alto VA. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work?
Well, sure. Going back to what I'd mentioned before, the genesis and the idea and all of the work to secure funding for the program, for the project rather, was done by Michael Nedelman, also in conversation with our composer, Andrew V. Lee. So they had this really phenomenal idea of creating a film about LGBT veterans' experiences with PTSD. And I was introduced to them by a colleague at UC Berkeley, where I'm a PhD student, who knew that I was running an LGBT veteran peer support group at VA Palo Alto. The support group really is based on the idea that there are many issues that are unique to LGBT veterans, from the types of experiences that they had in the military, such as anti-LGBT investigations and discharges, which we now know are probably related to disproportionately high rates of depression and suicide and anxiety among this population. And so in order for LGBT veterans to have the best chances at achieving their personal health and mental health goals, there are times when it's very, very helpful and in fact critical to be in environments where they're surrounded by other LGBT veterans so that they can talk about their unique experiences without fear that they will be met with rejection or anti-LGBT bias.
Heliana, this is Shelby. I wonder, just as a follow-up question, can you tell us a little bit about what those groups are like, just kind of how they typically go? I wonder if our audience might just be curious if they are interested in running similar groups, how they might go, what they look like.
Sure. So at VA Palo Alto, our LGBT veteran peer support group is entitled LOL, which represents Living Out Loud and Laughing Out Loud. And this was a group name that was created by the veterans in the group. Gives you a little bit of a sense that while we do deal with pretty heavy issues like gay bashing and military sexual trauma that uniquely targeted LGBT people in the service, we also have incredible moments of joy and laughter when LGBT veterans among their peers are given an opportunity to reflect on their strength and their resilience. So at VA Palo Alto, as I mentioned, it's a peer support group. There, since its inception, have always been 1 to 2 social work facilitators who are VA employees, and we oftentimes will start off the group asking a question that's related to something that's going on in the news or something that's going on at the VA. So, for example, in the month of June, when the VA observes Pride Month across the nation, one of the questions that we would ask is, why are you proud to be an LGBT veteran? And the first time that I asked this question was very interesting. The room was silent. You could hear crickets. And I began to realize that part of the reason might be this was the first time that this group had ever been asked what they were proud about as an LGBT service member or veteran. And conversely, most of the messaging that they had received was that they had to hide their LGBT identity while they were in the military. And many often talked about when they would come back to the U.S. following discharge, feeling like they had to hide their military identity when they would go into LGBT community spaces. And so a lot of the work that was done in this group was to help the identity consolidation or undermine the identity compartmentalization that was inherent to a lot of LGBT people's service under anti-LGBT service bans. We were really lucky that in 2013 we published an article, the LGBT veteran group members and myself, entitled If We Ask What They Might Tell. This is in the Journal of Homosexuality, and this article really describes the specific strategies that we used from designing the group such that we could have an incredible amount of diversity, right? We have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. We've even had people who are questioning or unsure what their sexual orientation or gender identity might be. But we also have large numbers of people of color involved in the group and women. And our group is very diverse also in terms of age, military branch, and war era. And part of the way that I think we've been able to do this successfully is based on the larger values that we bring to the group that are really committed to the ideas of diversity, that diversity makes us stronger as a community, and being willing to tackle head-on the issues of bias that are within the LGBT community, just like the larger society. This article also talks about very specific safety measures that we put in place. If we might recall, these are people who spent years at times, an entire lifetime of career, hiding who they were. And so to create an environment where they would feel safe to go and access care, in our group, we have the meeting in an undisclosed location. We also at times have invited the police to come around kind of in the area just to make sure that we don't have any problems from folks who might have anti-LGBT biases who would be interested in disrupting the group. And so this article, I think, was a really great opportunity not only to describe how the group was created, the specific and unique strategies we used for success in the group, but also was an opportunity for the LGBT veterans themselves to speak on their own behalf, which again is part of the reason why I was so thrilled when Michael Nedelman brought the idea of the Camouflage Closet to my attention.
Well, thank you. That is just, I think, so powerful. I think just makes me think about how oftentimes when we talk about the LGBT community, we can talk in terms of health deficits or mental health disparities. And I think that the way that you're framing the group just sounds like it really capitalizes on their strength and resilience in terms of, there might be some wisdom, some strengths that come from these experiences that we can really capitalize on. So thank you for sharing that. Let's talk a little bit more about the Camouflage Closet. The stories in this movie, in this film, were so well done. They really portrayed the veterans across a range of challenges and experiences, how they've coped with them, how they have utilized different supports, and the various healing processes that they have gone through. And so, Michael, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to your process for creating this film and how you work to capture these veterans' experiences.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the most important point here is that the veterans really captured their own experiences in a lot of ways. We used a process called video voice. This is sort of born out of an earlier process from the 90s called photo voice, which really just means you put the camera and the creative power into the hands of the experts, into the hands of people who can tell their own story. And so, it's really important to note that Heliana and I are both civilians. There's no way we could possibly tell even the stories of these 9 veterans, from our own standpoint. So the film was actually created using this very structured method, video voice. And what that essentially entailed was there were 3 phases that were kind of happening in parallel. The first phase was kind of like a filmmaking workshop. So we started off with, how to use the camera. What does it mean to film responsibly? We had these 2 HD tiny little handheld Canon cameras that we would then give out for a 1-week loan. So a couple of veterans would take the camera out, shoot whatever they wanted to shoot, and they would come back the following week. And that kind of brings us to phase 2. They would bring back clips and select a couple that they wanted to share with the group. and we'd have these structured positive feedback sessions. So it was really veterans responding to veterans in that way. And in the meantime, we were still having this filmmaking workshop. So each session was a little bit different. So for example, one of the sessions was using music to tell a story. So we actually had Andrew V. Lee, the composer we mentioned, come in and really take note of what sounds and what types of music the veterans wanted to use to tell their stories and to really play alongside the clips that they were capturing. Another workshop that we did was called Incorporating Archival Material. So you'll see some of the photos from before the military, during the military, that some of the veterans shared. The I Love Me book that one of the veterans flips through in the middle of the film. That all kind of came out of this idea of what are the different ways that we can tell a story, and what are the different ways that we can, share things that, at times can be very difficult, at times can really index this sort of place of resiliency. The third phase was after that sort of filmmaking process got into motion, then came the editing and the processing. We had some filmmaking sessions with Heliana and myself in which we'd string some of the narratives together that the veterans were already telling. And we would bring edits back to the group, little clips here and there, and we would have the veterans talk about those. Were they reflecting what the veterans were trying to say through the film? Did they look and sound like the veterans envisioned? And so every step along the way, they were not only filming their own material with these little handheld cameras and tripods, but they were also having an input in the music, in the editing, and also, meanwhile, in this weekly group, which was slightly separate from the veteran support group. They were two separate groups, even though our membership came from the veteran support group. There was a lot of processing of the sort of emotional reactions to a lot of these clips.
All of my therapy, all of my counseling has been wonderful. But in just bottom line for me though, this video class and my art therapy have actually done more for me faster, I think, in getting to the inside of me. The outside, I've been treating it for years, like I said. But as far as the really inside stuff, that's where we need to go, I've left it alone. I've been afraid to mess with it. There's a reason we don't poke a hornet's nest. And I'm so not looking forward to the stings. But it's part of it, so if you want the honey.
Which, of course, Heliana, being a mental health clinician, was very, very instrumental in. But again, at the end of the day, this is really veterans telling their own stories. And I think that's what, at least to me, made the film so powerful and meaningful.
Absolutely. The process is really designed to be empowering for the veterans to use their voice and share their own stories. I wonder, Michael, it sounds like the process, sounds like it was really a process as opposed to something where you just gave the veterans instructions and let them go on their way. It sounds like you were really involved through several stages of this, both of you. I wonder if throughout the process, if there was anything that surprised you or any stories that came to life that you weren't expecting.
I think that I came in with very few assumptions. I was really learning and listening along the way. I think one thing that really stuck with me, though, was just how incredibly diverse and different all of these 9 veterans were, not just in their, like, when they served or what their, backgrounds were, but also in how they told stories. They each had such a distinct voice. From, there's an intro sequence where one of the veterans, Lonnie, is flipping through these cards and kind of telling her story behind the cards. And it was something that, she brought to us. She said, "This is what I want to do. Here, hold the camera." She directed me, basically. I know I'm credited as a director, but she really came with this very specific vision. She came with nail polish because she wanted to design her nails in a certain way. That was very different from some of the other footage that was taken. A lot of evocative images. One of the veterans, in one of my most memorable shots, one of the veterans, Christine, filmed the water heater outside of her house, which when you see it in the film, it evokes a certain image. I don't want to give it away too much, but she's basically telling us something without really telling it. In the words that she mentions in the film was, "This is how I feel as an LGBT XYZ ex-military woman."
PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. It becomes a disorder when it's chronic. And so for me, the violence against me was chronic. It's how I feel sometimes as a LGBT XYZ ex-military woman.
I believe those are almost her exact words. And it was just the incredible creativity and diversity of voices. From that to more YouTube-style tutorials where a veteran would really get one-on-one with the camera. You feel like you're in the same space as them. And really you are while watching this film. I was really, really just impressed by how these 9 veterans with virtually no filmmaking experience essentially took this challenge to heart, addressed a lot of very difficult themes as well as some very resilient ones, and created their own narratives in these very artistic ways that a lot of professional filmmakers oftentimes try to emulate themselves. So it was 9 very wonderful, resilient, creative veteran artists who had more diversity among them than maybe I would have even imagined before I met them.
This is Anna just jumping in for a question. Definitely felt like one of the biggest strong points of the movie was this artistic component to it because you could see it through the filmmaking. And then I felt like you could also see it in their own individual artwork that the veterans showed throughout the movie. And for me, that seemed like a big theme. And so one of the things that I was just wondering, either for you, Michael, or Heliana, was the artwork that they kind of did outside of the video making part of the workshop, or was that something that they had already done in the group or independently, they were just artists?
You want to take that, Heliana, or?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Feel free.
Oh, well, yeah, so some of the artwork, I think the things that I'm thinking about were like the paintings that were featured, that was actually completely independent of the film. And I think as part of the sort of archival material that was incorporated into the film, that's a big part of the veterans' experience. So that was actually completely independent, but it just goes to show you the type of diversity that we had in the group. Yes, there might not have been, someone who's made 5 films in the group, but everyone had their own sort of different styles of storytelling, and some of those included art.
I would agree with that completely and add that for me as a clinician, I learned so much from these veterans and how they talked about the impact of art on their healing process, as well as how they communicated their experiences with PTSD and trauma through their art. And so just a couple of examples. The first one is that the first time that Andrew V. Lee brought in an original score to the group for the group members to listen to, it was this incredibly powerful, what I would describe as kind of like an experimental type song, which did not have a typical arc that we hear in much classical music. And the veterans, I remember sitting in the group as they're listening to this and seeing them have physiological reactions to the song. So I'm noticing people are gripping chairs, they're starting to look physically uncomfortable. And after the song played, and Michael, correct me if your memory is different than this, but I feel like I mentioned that to folks, like, gosh, you're looking a little physically uncomfortable. And the feedback we received was that the sound, because it was not on a trajectory that they could anticipate what was going to happen next, was actually triggering in a way that for many people who work with veterans who served in Iraq or Afghanistan, for example, where there are large oil fields that are burning, if those veterans, when they come home, smell burning oil, the olfactory sense can bring them back to a traumatic moment during their service. It seemed like the same thing or the same kind of process was happening when they were hearing music that was causing the feelings of confusion, lack of clarity of where things are going, and so on from their traumatic experiences. So that was a huge aha moment for me as a clinician. Mr. Lee brilliantly received their feedback, generously and graciously listened to what their feedback was, went home or to wherever it is that he writes his music, and then came back with an entirely new score for us. So that's an example of how not only the veterans, I'm not aware of any of the veterans necessarily being involved with composing music, but here their natural artistic sense really fed into the artistic development vis-a-vis the music of the film, but also I learned so much as a clinician. And I think that's part of one of the really powerful things that can happen when we engage in projects that are geared to shift the power dynamic that's typical in therapeutic relationships. So, for example, that we handed the camera to the subject population themselves, we end up with a very different film. Many films that include veterans and specifically LGBT veterans that are, produced by Hollywood or what have you, typically those films are directed and produced by a person who is not a veteran or not an LGBT veteran. And when we analyze those films, we see a narrative that's very similar to what the social science research tells us, which is really focusing on the challenges, on the discrimination that they've faced, and so on. In the Camouflage Closet, I believe because we handed the cameras to the veterans, and we all agreed as a project that we wanted to talk about trauma and recovery, the footage that they brought back to us really did talk about what has helped them in their own recovery processes.
They just followed us everywhere. And we would actually pull into cul-de-sacs. Cul-de-sacs. There's no way out, except to turn. And we would meet them coming out. We'd meet them going in, and we'd just wave at. I'm sorry. Please don't show all that heavy laughter. When we stopped at restaurants to eat or something, they wouldn't come in. They'd sit in the parking lot in the car, so we'd take them out. We'd take them out coffee or something like that. Let us know if we get too far ahead of you. Oh God! Well, we had to do something. If we hadn't treated it that way, it would have been even more awful on us. Just the emotional load and turmoil.
Several of the veterans talk about the critical role of art in their healing. Christine says at one point, if I didn't have art, I would be dead. Penny talks about how the film, which was not in any way a mental health intervention, instead it was an artistic project for the veterans to engage in creation of art. Penny says all of her therapy up to that point had been helpful, but it was only really treating the surface level symptoms. She said that being a part of this video project actually got to the deeper core part that she really needed to deal with. And she says that because of her involvement in the Camouflage Closet project, she then decides to go into residential trauma recovery programs.
I have finally decided to face the demons of my trauma. Because the help is available, I would be a fool to continue. My way has not worked. I was told by a therapist that I had a pretty good tight fit with that lid, and I might want to leave it where it was on that box. That I had managed to live my life and cope. But nobody sees you 24 hours a day, so they don't know, really, the dark hours, the terror of the nightmares, just the constant being on the alert. Nobody knows those things unless they experience it, and I hope to God they don't.
Because the help is available. And this is a very different narrative than all the other films that I'm aware of, at least, that talk about LGBT veterans and veterans in general. Those films, again, often not only talk about a real negative view of this population as having high rates of PTSD and so on, but oftentimes don't even mention that treatment is available and certainly don't mention that LGBT veterans can and do get better when they have the right pieces in their lives. And as many of the LGBT veterans in this film said of their own accord, we did not prompt them for this information, but they said to us that their art has been really important to their healing. I think the other piece that was an awareness for me as a clinician is that with video, people are able to communicate their experiences of things like PTSD, which in and of themselves oftentimes are difficult to put into words. So when somebody is having a PTSD triggering moment flashback, it's very, very difficult. I mean, they're downshifting from their cerebral cortex, right? So if we ask them, hey, what are you thinking? What are you feeling right now? It can be very difficult because their brain is just working in a crisis mode at that point. What it seems like from the example that Michael gave of the water heater that's tied up, very adeptly and succinctly in a way that spoke to my heart, my soul, my gut as a person who's watching this image, Christine was able to express to us what the experience was like serving under anti-LGBT military policies, what the experiences was like living through traumas that are still impacting her life today. And so it helped me to think that in all of my work, I want to create opportunities for my clients to communicate to me beyond written or verbal word, and especially when it involves PTSD, trauma, and so on.
And I would add to that also, in addition to the act of giving the camera to the veterans, I would add that, another major element is just the fact that it wasn't a group. And I want to go back to that amazing moment that Heliana mentioned where Andrew brought back some music samples to the group, and they had that reaction. And it was one of just many very just incredible moments where, and my recollection is really, and I sat there every single session. Every Thursday we met, and every session I would sit there and just take copious amounts of notes. What were the veterans saying? What did they want to see? What did they want to hear? And I remember in not just that situation, but many others as well, one veteran would start to say something, and then the others would kind of jump in and sort of fill in the blanks and piggyback on what they were saying. And there's a couple moments in the film where several of the veterans say, you know what, I did this for the group. I did this because, sometimes LGBT veterans just know what you're trying to say. They just get you, And we saw that so many times, even in the making of this film, that they sort of understood what each other was trying to say. So when something, which is a very different mode of production than your average Hollywood film, like Heliana was saying, because when, if a clip of music were to play and it were triggering to someone because it, for example, didn't have this sort of predictable arc of a classical piece, for example, it's one thing to show that to one person, but it's one thing to show that to a group of 9 people who can really describe and sort of give an artistic rendering, but also a very personal and affecting rendering of how that makes them feel and what they really need to be seeing and what they really need to be hearing in that moment. And so it was because of that room that was filled with these veterans every week working on this film that we just got this such a rich picture of what they wanted to see and hear that I think wouldn't have been possible had we just been doing it one person at a time or just filming our own interviews with each veteran.
Michael, I completely agree with that. And I think that the other piece that was so critical was that the way that I think all of us approached the group with humility. So, for example, Michael was not only the mastermind behind the idea of the film and did all of, or pretty much most of the legwork, if not all, to secure the funding from a variety of funding sources for the film. And he did all of the editing of the film with feedback from the veterans in the group, but somehow, as a medical student at Stanford University, also managed to bring meals to every single group that we had. And so you'll see in the credits, he's actually listed as the caterer for the film. But because he did things like that, the veterans in the film project knew that Michael is a medical student and that he's at this incredibly prestigious and powerful university. Here he is coming into the group bringing food to people. And I think that is a very different way of approaching conversations that are very difficult and challenging. So one, I think he showed up every week in a way that not only was he sharing the incredible wealth of talents with us, but he was also attending to our physical needs. And I think that's one thing that I also have not seen in a lot of trauma group work is we know that when we're doing trauma work, people have physiological reactions. And yet oftentimes the most attention we give to their physiological reactions is perhaps passing them a box of tissue. In the film, you see veterans who are sitting around a table where there's water and there's food, and I think that the act of sharing food and beverage, it was a way also of grounding in the present moment, while their thoughts of what they were talking about might have taken them back to Fallujah, for example, or Vietnam. There also could then stop and do grounding exercises, which we did throughout the film project, to say, okay, that memory is from 30 years ago, 5 years ago, what have you. Right now, you were in this room. And so being able to focus on, the taste, the textures of food, or what the exact room location was like, or the sound of the laughter of other people in the room, or what have you, those things helped us to, I think, create a space where people were able to get very direct and real with these deep traumas, but in a way that they were held with humility and I think generosity and a real grounding way of being from the people who are around them.
I'm learning a lot from this conversation as a clinician. I'm just thinking about how much you are both speaking to not so much maybe what we're doing, but how we're doing it. The attitude, the approach, the way that we think of ourselves as equals to our clients, and that we're, meeting on the same level. And so I'm wondering, you've given so many examples of things that you both have learned throughout this process. And I'm just wondering, Heliana, maybe starting with you, what do you think are the most important takeaways from this film in terms of how VA can provide the best care to our LGBT veterans, how clinicians can provide the best care to our LGBT veterans? What do you think are the most important messages that you are hoping all of us can walk away from this experience with?
Sure, thank you. I think the first thing that I realized is that we will see what we look for. And so while the veterans in this film share an incredible amount of experience that could be easily referred to as post-traumatic growth, as stress-related growth, nowhere in the LGBT veteran literature have I seen mention of post-traumatic growth or stress-related growth. And in fact, recent studies are finding that 75% of veterans who are diagnosed with PTSD within the VA will mention at least one type of post-traumatic growth, as well as difficulties living with PTSD. And so I think that was very important for me. And thinking about LGBT veterans who not only survived, but oftentimes thrived in extremely hostile, difficult environments reminds me that we as clinicians and VA at large can learn so much from the strategies that they inherently kind of develop as individuals and as part of a larger LGBT community. So for example, and especially the idea of intersectionality. So at one point, Lonnie, who identifies as a Japanese-American Marine veteran, who is also a transgender woman, says, talking about her closet, she lives with family who do not know that she's transgender. And so she always presents in male clothing at home, and she'll change typically in her car where she keeps makeup and some clothes, but she says her closet in her parents' house is overflowing. Half of it is filled with men's clothing and half of it is filled with women's clothing. And she says it's like PTSD, like that place where you want to keep all the bad memories hidden.
In my closet, it's pretty much divided. I have my male clothing one side and the female on the other. So, of course, my room is getting a little bit cramped. Having to keep that hidden all the time. It's like how, like when you have PTSD, where you have those bad memories, you just want to keep it locked away.
And that reminded me that contrary to beliefs that the more marginalized identities a person has, the more we would expect them to have mental health challenges, that there's also something that can happen when people have multiple minority statuses or multiple challenges in their lives, that the lessons that they learn through survival in one part of their life can help them to get through another. So here, Lonnie's experience and working through therapy and other things around her PTSD is helping by creating a metaphor that relates directly to her experience of being a transgender person who has to conceal that identity at home. And then I would say the final piece here is attending to all of the things that we typically, that are beyond the specific diagnosis. So thinking about moral injury, for example, among LGBT veterans, the idea that somebody can experience a trauma that is so seismically earth-shaking that they then don't know who they are, they don't know who the world is around them, they're not able to trust, and they think this is going to be a permanent thing, that some of these moral injuries that we know are common to service members who saw combat, for example, might be even more challenging and numerous among LGBT veterans who not only had to deal with seeing somebody dying on a battlefield, but maybe they were sexually assaulted by a colleague who thought that they wanted to teach them a lesson, an idea of corrective rape, that, well, if she just had a good man, she wouldn't be a lesbian. But the idea that LGBT service members who were facing the battle the next day might have been more likely to see a military chaplain if they were scared that the next day they were going to die in battle, and they had difficult problems with the fact that they were LGBT vis-a-vis religious messaging that they had received. And it was not uncommon for military chaplains at times to then turn in that LGBT service member to command, which would then result in an investigation and discharge and ruin of their lives, essentially. So for us to start thinking about, it's important that we've got a list of diagnoses that we're looking at, but what are all the other parts of a person's life? Moral injury, like a sense of love, like a sense of connection and post-traumatic growth and strength that do not necessarily easily fit into a list of diagnoses. And that when we start to attend to those aspects of people's lives as well, not only might we have better mental health outcomes, but also we as clinicians can learn so much from these people who are really our teachers, because most of us, when we were in school, were not privileged to have professors talking about military health in general, and certainly not LGBT military and veteran health in specific. So where are we going to learn from? We can learn from our LGBT veteran clients.
Thank you so much, Heliana. I totally agree. That was a great takeaway. And Michael, I don't know if there's any important takeaways that you'd like to share.
Sure. Yeah, I think I want to affirm basically everything that Heliana just said. I think that, I was, I'm not someone who's involved in day-to-day, veteran mental health care. But I think for myself, I was learning all of those things. And plus, I think you mentioned one of the big takeaways. I think you expressed it already very well, is that what we're doing is just as important as how we're doing it. And how we're telling stories and things of that nature. And then I think the other big takeaway for me, and Heliana has really sort of said this in other words, is just listen. The importance of really listening and sort of upending what often occurs among providers and patients as a power dynamic, or even among filmmakers and film subjects. The importance of really listening, that there's such an incredible diversity just among these 9 veterans that are in the film. The film itself isn't meant to be a stand-in for all LGBT veterans. It's just these 9 veterans. And so, if only one were to listen, what they might learn. And so in my job as a journalist, this comes into play all the time, especially when I'm approaching questions or issues that relate to mental health. You really have to know to ask the right questions, and you have to know when to listen. So being attuned to those aspects of resiliency when I'm talking to folks who are mental health advocates is very, very important. And you often get an entirely different story or a much more rich story when you ask about those things and when you listen and give space to that. And that's certainly come into play in my journalistic work. So I really, really would just stress the importance of listening and opening up that space to get those aspects of resiliency and get that story that maybe isn't being told quite so often.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to hear more about this project and all of the wonderful work that went into it. The movie is amazing, and thank you for sharing the experience with us here today.
Thanks, everyone, for being here today with us for the Rocky Mountain Short Takes podcast. You can ask for your own screening of the Camouflage Closet like we did at the Denver VA, and we had a large audience attend. Heliana would like to say this if you are interested in a screening.
When people request to screen the film, The Camouflage Closet, we ask them to sign a memorandum of understanding. And that memorandum of understanding requests that anyone who screened the film, especially in front of groups of audiences, be very careful to ensure that the first several clips of the film, which are white text on a black background, which describe that the film was made in the Video Voice process where veterans were in control of cameras, but also warns the audience that military sexual trauma is directly and explicitly discussed in the film, and that happens at a point when somebody is flipping through an I Love Me book. And we bring that up because when Saving Private Ryan was released in the 90s, there was an increase in veterans who were presenting to ERs with suicidal ideation. And the thought is that because there was images of combat were so realistic in this film and more realistic than previous films about war, it was triggering folks who were in civilian society. So we not only ask people to sign this MOU and to make sure that the audience is warmed about this, but also to make sure that there is a mental health provider, at least one in the audience, who has been identified to the entire audience before the film starts. So that way, if somebody is triggered, they know who they can get support from immediately at that moment. We have had no problems whatsoever, to my knowledge, of veterans being triggered by the film and having adverse events after seeing the film. To the contrary, we've had incredible responses from veterans who have seen the film. Even one LGBT person who I believe is not a veteran who saw the film by random chance at a conference and then put a blog post up saying that he was living with PTSD and it's so bad that he oftentimes isolates, and that morning he didn't even think he'd be able to leave his hotel room, and he struggles with suicidal ideation. And that seeing the way that the veterans in this film talked about refusing to allow themselves to take suicidal action, even though they were suffering so much, because they believe that they're meant to be here, because they don't want to injure the loved ones who are left behind.
I'm supposed to be here. So if I take my life, I'm just going to have to come back and do it all over again. And I'm not prepared for that.
This LGBT civilian who saw the film says that watching them talk about their thought processes regarding suicide was life-changing for him.
Thanks, Heliana. And again, we would encourage you to ask for a screening of this very important and wonderful film. We appreciate you listening to this podcast. And listeners, you can learn more about the movie, again, how to host a screening, and about the important work being done with our LGBT veterans by clicking on the links accompanying the podcast. You can also reach out to us if you have any comments or questions. Please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, give us a review, and share with colleagues and friends. Until next time, this has been the Rocky Mountain Short Takes podcast.